about the real problem. This is cellular inflammation and why it keeps you stuck. So here's the deal with hormones. Through our own choices and through our own habits and things like that, which is the cause of cellular inflammation, which we're gonna get into, say through food choices and stress and things like that, that doesn't just happen overnight. The hormones don't break overnight. They just don't go into flux overnight. This is a progression that happens over the years. So I just want to be very, very clear with that. And here's how it actually plays out step by step. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw the cell so you can get a really good understanding of what's going on here. This is actually the outside of the cell, which I actually drew. This is considered the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is actually considered the intelligence or the brain of the cell because it actually controls what gets in the cell and also what gets out of the cell. Many people actually think the brain is the nucleus, which we'll call it the NUC, the nuke, but the nucleus is actually more of a hard drive. When we're talking about a computer, it stores a bunch of data and the cell actually accesses that data when it needs it. But that's essentially controlled by the cell membrane because that's the brain of the cell. And then we have the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion is actually the energy or the powerhouse of the cell. So we're going to talk about energy, and this is actually where all the energy is created, and through creating that energy it also creates a waste product which happens inside of the cell, and it's excreted inside the cell, which needs to eventually leave the cell. Now on the outside of the cell we have little receptors, and these are nutrient receptors. We'll call them NR. So when nutrients actually come to the cell, they actually latch onto the nutrient receptors, and then they actually go inside of the cell, and the cell is able to use them as fuel. And then here we also have hormone receptors on the cell, call them HR, so that when our body actually shoots hormone signals and releases hormones, it actually goes onto the hormone receptors, and then the reception goes inside the cell and it communicates with the cell, and the cell responds and it utilizes those signals right there. Okay, so there's the function of the cell right here. So then what happens? Where does cellular inflammation come into play? So through our habits, through poor food choices, through stress, through lack of sleep, through toxin exposure. Toxin exposure can come through highly processed foods. It can come through, say, heavy metal exposure. It can come through, say, mold in our house if we're unaware of it. It can come from environmental factors. What happens from all those actual habits and exposures is we get cellular inflammation. And essentially the actual cell membrane or the brain of the cell becomes completely inflamed and completely aggravated, so that essentially nothing can now get in the cell and nothing can actually get out of the cell. Now we actually have nutrition, which is trying to get to the nutrient receptors over here. And guess what? Because of the actual inflammation that's happening here, the nutrient receptors pretty much cannot actually take the nutrition at all, and it can't get it in the cell because there's so much inflammation here. The cell membrane actually does not allow it to get through the cell. And same thing with the hormone signaling over here on the right. We get more hormone signals released from the body, but the hormone receptors, because of that cellular inflammation, they can't actually receive the signal properly. They're not reading it properly, and those signals, again, they cannot get in the cell. They're trapped outside of the cell, and more or less there is no communication inside of the cell because of the actual cellular inflammation. Now on top of that, we talked about the mitochondrion, which is the actual energy source, the actual powerhouse of the cell. And it's actually creating energy on the inside, and the byproduct of that energy is a waste product. So we have toxicity that's actually built up into the cell. And because of the actual inflammation, the cellular inflammation on the outside of the cell, nothing can actually get out. The toxicity is trying to actually be released through the cell, but the actual cell membrane is not letting it out because there's so much inflammation. And now we have cellular inflammation. So that is cellular inflammation. And this is step number 1. And this is, again, due to our behaviors, our food choices, lack of sleep, stress, toxin exposure. And that leads us to that cellular inflammation. And now the next step of that is going to be the inflammation actually messes up the hormone signals. And we actually talked about that in this particular process. And it also actually messes up the actual nutrient absorption and the nutrition signals, or the ability for the cell to use the nutrients. And this actually leads to weight loss resistance. And this is where, no matter what you do, you're unable to lose weight. You've tried diet after diet after diet. You're eating less, you're eating more, you're working out less, you're working out more. And no matter what you do, you cannot lose the weight. And it really comes down to the fact that you have cellular inflammation. And because of that, that's actually messed up your hormone signals. And it's also messed up your ability to actually absorb nutrients and use nutrition inside the cell. And our body cannot lose weight. Now, as this continues over time, in terms of we continue those poor food choices, the lack of sleep, the increased stress in our lives, the toxins exposure, this just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And what this does is it now leads to insulin resistance. And essentially what insulin resistance is it's going to be where we have blood in our body and we have sugar molecules in the blood. And then our body, we have a pancreas, which releases insulin. The insulin goes in and it grabs the sugar. And what it's supposed to do is then transport the sugar to a cell. But the thing is that actually it cannot transport the sugar to the cell. Okay, the insulin is ineffective at transporting that sugar to the cell, and it leaves that sugar in the bloodstream. And we have an overabundance of sugar in the bloodstream. And here we have prediabetes. Also, the body is storing fat here, especially in the belly. Not convenient at all. And then as, again, these habits continue over time, the poor food choices, the lack of sleep, the increased stress, the toxins, it's gone from cellular inflammation to weight loss resistance. Now we can't lose the weight. Now we have high blood sugar. We have prediabetes. We have diabetes. And now this actually gets into what's called a full metabolic dysfunction, also known as metabolic syndrome. And that is essentially all of these things happening. You have cellular inflammation, you have weight loss resistance, you have insulin resistance, and that whole pool together is considered this metabolic syndrome. And this is when we have no energy, our ability to burn fat basically is slowed down to a complete crawl, and we have complete dysfunction in the body. And I wanted to go through all these because we hear these words. We hear cellular inflammation, we hear weight loss resistance, we hear insulin resistance, we hear metabolic syndrome, but it's like, well, how do all these actually relate? And it essentially is a linear process where the habits are essentially the starter. This is the thing that lights the fire. Then it leads to cellular inflammation. All right, and then we keep the habits going, and that leads to weight loss resistance. We can't lose the weight. And we keep the habits going, and it leads to insulin resistance. We have high blood sugar, prediabetes, diabetes, and we keep those habits going, and that leads to that full-fledged metabolic syndrome. And that's really how all that works right there. So how do we fix it? We have to go deeper than diet and exercise. We have to reset our body from the inside out with a full systemic cellular detox.